Canada has an official map and a real one. The official map shows roads, municipalities, registered land, census tracts. It shows where people are supposed to be. The real map, the one that doesn't exist in any government database, shows something else entirely. Communities that have operated for decades inside Canadian territory without any functional record of their daily existence. Not because they're hidden in the way we usually think of hiding. No underground bunkers, no elaborate concealment, just the deliberate, principled, and sometimes desperate choice to remain outside the apparatus that defines legal existence in a modern state. Some of them refused modernity out of doctrine. Others out of a deep historical trauma with governments that once persecuted them. Others made a cold political calculation that invisibility was the most efficient form of collective survival available to them. And some simply existed in a territory so vast that no system of registration ever reached them, and nobody with the authority to act ever considered that a problem worth solving. Canada is large enough to contain permanent absences. That's not an accident of geography, it's a structural feature of the country, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. What follows is a countdown of 13 communities that exist, or existed, or may still exist somewhere inside Canadian territory without any verified record in the public archives that are supposed to account for everyone living there. We move from the visible edges of invisibility down to the place where documentation ends entirely, and the territory simply continues. There's a particular kind of quiet in Aylmer, Ontario, that doesn't feel like rural silence. It feels chosen. The old order Mennonite community here has been present for generations. If you drive through, you'll see it. Horse-drawn buggies on paved roads, plain clothing, farmhouses without power lines running to them. Nothing is hidden. The community exists in plain sight. And that's precisely what makes it interesting from a documentation standpoint. Old order Mennonites don't use telephones. They don't vote. They don't maintain digital presence of any kind. Their children are educated within the community, their disputes resolved internally, their records kept in church ledgers that no provincial database has ever accessed. When a child is born, the birth may eventually be registered, but often late, sometimes very late, and frequently only when some external necessity forces the interaction with civil administration. The Canadian state knows this community exists. It has known for a long time. The question isn't visibility, it's functional presence. In every database that actually matters for how a modern government tracks and serves its population, this community is effectively absent. No electoral rolls, no digital health records, no social insurance integration. Nothing that would allow any agency to answer the question, how many people live here and what are their conditions? The answer, in practical terms, is, we don't know. And the follow-up question, why don't we know, doesn't appear to have generated any particular urgency. This is where we begin. With a community that is visible, technically documented in fragments, and yet functionally invisible to the mechanisms of the state that surrounds it. The communities ahead of it in this countdown are less visible. Some of them are barely visible at all. There are more than 350 Hutterite colonies in Canada. That number sounds precise. And it isn't. Hutterites are communal Anabaptists who have lived in agricultural colonies across the Canadian prairies since the early 20th century. They're registered, broadly speaking. Colonies hold land titles. They pay certain taxes. There's a formal relationship between the Hutterite colonies and the Canadian state that from a distance looks like integration. Look closer, and it fractures. Within the broader Hutterite network, schisms have occurred repeatedly over the decades, splits over doctrine, over the degree of permissible contact with the outside world, over leadership, over discipline. When a colony splits, the breakaway group sometimes establishes a new community. That community may or may not notify provincial authorities. It may or may not register births systematically. Its members may or may not update any documentation to reflect their new location. At least a dozen colonies across Alberta and Manitoba have operated for extended periods, in some cases decades, without any updated registration with provincial authorities. People born there, raised there, married there, buried there. complete life cycles inside communities that exist in a kind of administrative limbo. The government knows the parent colony, but has no formal record of the daughter community that formed when things broke apart. The interesting part isn't the schism. Religious communities split all the time. It's what happens after. The Canadian state has no effective mechanism for tracking when a registered community fractures and a new unregistered one forms somewhere nearby. And without that mechanism, the new community simply begins to accumulate invisible generations. Haida Gwaii is an archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia, and it is one of the most politically complicated pieces of land in Canada. The Haida Nation holds inherent title over these islands, a claim that the Canadian courts have moved, slowly and incompletely, toward acknowledging. The provincial government of British Columbia has jurisdiction in theory. In practice, the relationship between provincial authority and Haida governance is a negotiation that has never fully resolved. Into this unresolved space, sometime in the 1980s, a group of non-Indigenous families arrived. They came looking for land, for distance, for something the mainland had stopped offering. They found it, informally. They settled with tacit local tolerance, without any provincial land grant or formal permission, in a corner of the archipelago, where the overlapping jurisdictions created a gap that no single authority was clearly responsible for closing. What they built there is, legally speaking, impossible to describe cleanly. The provincial government considers their presence irregular, technically an occupation of Crown land without authorization. The Haida Nation has, at various points, tolerated their presence as neighbors rather than challenged it as trespass. The federal government has no direct role. 3 generations on, descendants of those original families live in structures built without permits, on land without title, in a jurisdiction that has never decided what to do with them. The provincial government has records indicating these families exist. What those records have never produced is an action. Some absences are negligence, some are policy. This one feels like the second, a deliberate choice to let an unresolvable situation remain unresolved, because resolving it would require deciding something nobody wants to decide. Lacrete, in the Peace River region of northern Alberta, is the most isolated road-accessible Mennonite municipality in Canada. It's remote by any standard. The highway that reaches it is long and lonely, and the landscape around it is the kind of flat that makes you feel exposed even when you're inside a building. But Lacrete itself isn't what concerns us here. What concerns us are the communities that formed around it, groups that split from Lacrete's own Mennonite community because they considered it too permissive, too connected to the outside, too willing to accommodate. This is isolation in chain. These groups were already among the most isolated Mennonites in Canada. They isolated themselves further. They moved out of Lacrete, established their own settlements on surrounding land, and began operating with even less contact with provincial or federal systems than their parent community maintained. Some of these satellite communities appear on satellite images, clusters of farm buildings, outbuildings, fenced fields. They don't appear on any official municipal map. They don't have registered addresses. Their members don't appear in provincial voter rolls. And because they're small enough and quiet enough, no government agency has ever found sufficient reason to determine formally what's there. The phrase, sufficient reason, does a lot of work in this story. It will keep doing it. In 2003, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, produced an internal document that was later obtained, partially, through an access to information request. The document mentions, in passing, a closed agricultural community of unidentified religious orientation located in northern Saskatchewan. Population, approximately 200. Behavior, no engagement with provincial services. Children, present, but unaccounted for in any school registry or health database. The document does not name the community. It does not name the religion. It does not provide coordinates beyond a general regional reference. And it does not contain any follow-up action, any referral to provincial child welfare authorities, or any indication that anyone considered what it might mean for 200 people, including an unknown number of children, to be living entirely outside the reach of any public health or education system. What it contains instead is a single notation suggesting that the matter was flagged for further review. There is no publicly available record of that review ever occurring. 200 people. Unidentified religion, unidentified location. Children whose existence is not recorded in any provincial database. And the only trace of official awareness is a document that was itself partially redacted before anyone outside the government could read it. This is where the tone shifts. We've moved from curious to something with a harder edge. In 2019, an investigative report documented something that the Manitoba provincial government had quietly known about for years. Across multiple ultra-conservative Mennonite colonies in southern Manitoba, the rate of birth registration between 1990 and 2010 was below 40%. In some colonies, significantly below. The children were born. They grew up. They were educated within the colony, married within the colony, in some cases died within the colony. Their existence was never reported to the state, and because registration wasn't happening, neither was anything else. No health card, no school record, no social insurance number, no legal identity of any kind. The provincial government was formally notified about this pattern, not after the investigative report, years before it. Provincial officials were aware that large numbers of children in identifiable communities were growing up without any civil documentation whatsoever. No systematic corrective action followed. The response was, in bureaucratic terms, almost nothing. Some communication with community leaders, some encouragement to comply voluntarily, and then quiet. The children are adults now. Some of them still have no legal identity recognized by the Canadian state. They cannot obtain passports, cannot access federal benefits, cannot prove citizenship in the country where they were born, and the government knew. That's the part that doesn't resolve easily. The Similkameen Valley in the southern interior of British Columbia drew a particular kind of seeker in the 1970s. People who wanted land, distance, and freedom from a society they decided wasn't worth participating in. Some of them arrived, some of them stayed, some of them never left. A community that formed there in the early 1970s is, as far as can be documented from outside, still present. Not the same people. The founders are elderly now, and some are gone. But their children are there, and their grandchildren. 3 generations inside a settlement built without permits, on land acquired through informal arrangements that never produced a legal title, without access to the provincial power grid, without water infrastructure connected to any municipal system. The provincial government has records of at least 2 inspection visits, sent presumably to assess the buildings, the land use, the situation. Neither visit produced any public conclusion. No enforcement action, no formal order, no documentation of what was actually found. What that means, practically, is that the provincial government has confirmed it knows this community exists, deployed representatives to observe it, and then filed nothing. Silence after investigation is a different kind of silence than silence from ignorance. It's more deliberate, and it raises questions that the documentation, by design, never answers. This one doesn't have a name, and that itself is the first thing worth sitting with. Sometime in the 1990s, a group of people who had been expelled from, or had fled, an international religious organization established a community in remote northern Ontario. They weren't forming a new religion. They weren't adopting an alternative belief system. They were simply a group of people who had survived something together, who trusted each other and no one else, and who decided that the most rational response to what they'd experienced was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and any institution, religious, governmental, corporate, that claimed authority over their lives. They chose a location without road access. They chose no formal name. They chose no registered leadership structure. They built without permits, settled without title, and made a collective decision that existing outside the record was not a problem to solve, but a condition to maintain. Ex-members, people who eventually left, have described the community in interviews with independent researchers. From those accounts, the settlement was functional, relatively stable, and deliberately ungovernable from the outside. Not because it was violent or coercive, but because it had been engineered, insofar as a community can be engineered, to resist the categories the state uses to locate and account for people. No Canadian government database contains any record of this community. No map shows it. And since the accounts come exclusively from people who left and chose to speak, there is no way of knowing whether what they describe still exists, or whether it dissolved quietly, the way it formed. There is a Mennonite colony in northern Manitoba that cannot be reached by road. In winter, snowmobile tracks connect it to the nearest accessible point. In summer, it is reachable only by small aircraft. The federal government is aware of its existence. Supply flights have generated aviation records that document the location, the frequency of deliveries, and the rough population it must sustain. That's the extent of the documentation. No provincial health authority operates inside its boundaries. No school registered with the Manitoba education system functions there. No child welfare agency has ever conducted an assessment. No electoral officer has ever visited. No census enumerator has reached it by any method that produced a publicly available record. The distance isn't incidental. The founders of this colony chose this specific location precisely because the distance meant the state couldn't reach them without considerable effort. And the state, presented with that effort as a barrier, has consistently decided not to make it. Think about what that means for the children growing up there. Born without registration, educated without curriculum oversight, with no legal identity, no health records, no citizenship documentation, inside the country whose territory they inhabit. And the only reason the state knows they're there at all is that someone has to fly in the flour and the diesel. This one is harder to describe because there is no established category for it. At some point, the exact timeline isn't clear from the available accounts. A group formed in the Northwest Territories composed of descendants of intermarriages between Mennonite families and members of First Nations communities. Over time, this group developed practices that drew from both traditions and belonged cleanly to neither. They are not a registered First Nation. They have never sought that status, and have, by some accounts, explicitly refused it. They are not a Mennonite colony in any recognizable sense. They don't maintain the theological framework or the community structure associated with Mennonite settlement. They are, in administrative terms, undefined. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. The Canadian state has mechanisms for handling most forms of community: registered First Nations, Mennonite colonies, off-grid settlements, religious organizations. These all have bureaucratic categories, however imperfect. A community that refuses all of those categories, that exists in the spaces between them, creates a problem that the bureaucracy is structurally unable to solve. It doesn't fit the forms, so the forms aren't filled. And a community without forms is, in the only sense that matters to the state, not a community at all. Two documents mention it, neither names it. The first is an environmental assessment from 2011 about land use in ecological transition zones along the Alberta Northwest Territories border. In a footnote that reads like something that almost got cut, the report notes, "Evidence of sustained human habitation in an area not corresponding to any registered settlement or land title." The second is an internal Alberta government dispatch about irregular occupation of Crown land in the same general region. It describes briefly a community of undetermined size. No follow-up is attached to the dispatch. No site visit is recorded. No referral to any other agency appears in any subsequent document that has been made publicly available. Two bureaucratic traces. No name, no population estimate. No description of what kind of community it is, what language its members speak, what year it was founded, or whether it's still there. The community exists in the public record the way a shadow exists, as evidence that something was blocking the light, without any information about what that something was. This requires a brief piece of context. Ultra-conservative Mennonite groups have moved between countries for over a century. They left Russia for Canada, left Canada for Mexico and Paraguay, left Mexico for Bolivia, left Bolivia for Argentina. This mobility isn't wandering, it's systematic. When a government becomes too intrusive, too demanding, too threatening to the community's way of life, the community moves. They buy land through agents. They arrive. They build. What some of these groups have also done, at least in several documented cases, is use tourist visas to enter Canada and not leave. At least one colony now operating in Saskatchewan has been there since the early 2000s. Its members entered Canada legally as visitors. They acquired land through purchase. They built. They began having children, and they never initiated any formal immigration process. No permanent residency application, no citizenship proceedings. Nothing that would have required interaction with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada in a way that generated a formal record of their presence as settlers rather than tourists. The provincial government of Saskatchewan has no registered record of this colony's founding. Its members are, in the technical sense, overstays, though the term feels inadequate for people who have now raised a generation of children on Canadian soil. The children born there were born in Canada. Their citizenship status is, under Canadian law, arguably clear. Their parents' status is not. And nobody, not the federal government, not the province, appears to have determined what to do about that, or whether doing anything about it is even a priority. There is no name for this one. What exists? A private ecclesiastical letter, dated 1987, written between bishops of an ultra-conservative Mennonite denomination. The letter has been seen by at least 2 independent researchers, neither of whom has published its full contents. What has been shared from the letter is a reference, brief, elliptical, to the northern community. No coordinates, no province, no population. No context explaining what the northern community is, or how it came to be, or what its relationship is to the denomination whose bishops apparently knew of its existence. What else exists? 3 testimonies from former members of various ultra-conservative Mennonite communities who, in separate interviews across different years, mentioned having heard of a community established further north than any of the settlements they came from. None of them had been there. None of them knew its precise location. 2 of them weren't certain it still existed when they spoke. That's the complete archive. A letter, 3 second-hand accounts. No satellite image has been matched to any description. No government document contains any reference. No researcher has confirmed a location. If this community exists, it exists in silence so complete that even the systems designed to track unusual land use and irregular settlement in remote territory have never picked up a legible signal from it. If it stopped existing at some point, if the people dispersed or moved or simply ended, that ending left no mark either. A community that appears and disappears without documentation is, by every formal measure, a community that never existed. The land where it stood would show no trace of having been inhabited by people who made a collective decision, who built something, who raised children, who buried their dead. The territory continues. The record, if the record was ever created, is gone. Canada has an official map. It shows 38 million people across 10 million square kilometres. Somewhere in the distance between those 2 numbers, between the count and the territory, there are people this map cannot find. Some of them chose that. Some of them were never given an alternative. Some of them are the children of choices made before they were born, living lives that the state that surrounds them has no record of and no mechanism to document. The satellite image that opened this video shows telhados, rooftops, in a field with no connecting road. If you look at it long enough, you start wondering not just who's there, but who decided not to look. The coordinates have been removed. The place still exists. Make of that what you will.